TVB East, and I'm just going to tell you guys a little bit about some of the important things that went on throughout the trip. I wanted to hide my skin. No color, no place here. For the first time in my life, being white was making me feel uncomfortable. It gave me up as an outsider, as a foreigner, as one of the many volunteers that flowed through South Africa's townships. I had eagerly come to South Africa to work with Pledge Aid, a small nonprofit that provided public health services to township communities in Plettenberg Bay, a tiny coastal town. I had been assigned to work with Zoe, one of their caregivers. Zoe has a magnetic force. I had been instantly attracted to her when we met. Her smile was radiant, her eyes glowed. She seemed more alive than anyone I had ever interacted with. Zoe walked with a slight limp, her foot maimed from a previous accident. Today, we walked slow and steady over the dusty footpaths of Bosiegift, our arms intertwined, her rich brown skin linked with my ivory arms. Upon my arrival, Zoe had quickly taken me in as her mentee, and then as her child. She nurtured and grew me in any way she could, explaining her way of life, her deep faith, and her hardships. It took me a long time to truly understand how special her affection to me was. It took me a long time to understand that in our simplest interactions, that when we walked with our arms intertwined, there was deep symbolism that counteracted the way that South Africa has functioned for centuries. South Africa was colonized by the Dutch in the mid-1600s, and then recolonized later by the British. The British dominated politics, trade, financing, and industry. White minority rule officially began in the late 40s, creating legal racial segregation, known as apartheid. Apartheid just ended about 20 years ago. Now, I knew about apartheid before coming to South Africa, but like the US Civil Rights Movement, it was in South Africa's past, wasn't it? I soon realized I had been naive to think that such racial tension had been relieved in South Africa over the span of only 2 decades, especially after seeing the racial prejudice that was still present in my own backyard almost a half-century after our own civil rights movement. I quickly saw the huge chasm within the country. At night, I resided in the beautiful houses that lined one of Plet's many beaches. There were quaint restaurants, neighborhood parks, nearby grocery stores, and boutique shopping, all within walking distance. The townships were a sharp contrast. There were one-room, cardboard constructed homes, small shops stuck into shipping containers, and crudely constructed pathways, all perched on top of a hill that overlooked the bustling life of the Plet that I went back to when nighttime fell. Though there was no longer a legal reason for separation, the rough hilltop townships were predominantly black in colored, with a few white volunteers to be occasionally spotted. And the ritzy beachside Plet was predominantly white, except for a few black and colored, blue-collared workers. What I hadn't understood was that despite apartheid ending, racial prejudice still hadn't. It was still hard for people in the townships to land a job, to receive a formal education, to have access to health care, to have ownership of a decent home simply because of their skin color. And my eager white face resembled the face of their oppressor, a constant reminder to everyone in the townships that the people who thought that they could now save them from poverty are the same white faces that put them there in the first place. Now I understand the beauty of Zoe and my friendship. I understand how difficult it must have been for her to let me into her life and her heart. I understand that in being white, I am privileged. Lesson plans. I spent my night making lesson plans, and flashcards, and visual aids. I spent my night worrying that my Indian students wouldn't understand my lesson plans. I spent my night wishing that they would just sit still and keep quiet long enough for me to go through one round of flashcards. I spent my night desperately searching for markers to make my visual aids remotely understandable. I'm not an artist. I'm also not a trained teacher. This thought had never actually crossed my mind until arriving in India. I had assumed that my presence alone would be enough, that because I had gone through over 12 years of schooling, I was qualified to now teach. And maybe, just maybe, I could have succeeded in a conventional American classroom, but a village schoolhouse in Jaipur was a different ballgame. There was no attendance taken in the mornings. My students changed from day to day. There were no desks, no discipline after breaking rules, and few basic teaching resources, like chalk, paper, and pencils. There was also a language barrier. My students were young, just beginning to learn India's national language, Hindi. I only had an hour's class worth of Hindi under my belt. I was thoroughly unprepared for the task that had been given to me, and soon my dreams of turning around these children's lives by teaching them math and English fell by the wayside. I felt hopeless. Even worse, I felt useless. What I hadn't realized when signing up was that I was my students' only teacher. There were 3 administrators that regulated the schoolhouse, but teaching was a job left solely to volunteers. Foreign volunteers moved in a constant flow throughout the schoolhouse, sometimes staying for as little as a week, and usually staying for no more than a month. The next volunteer had no contact with the previous one. I had no idea what the volunteer before me had tried to teach, what he or she had found most effective in engaging the children, what the children had actually learned, or which students required more help in certain areas. So I taught the children as if they were blank slates, rather than complex human beings. This is how it went on for weeks, day by day attempting to teach the same thing in the same way to the same people. Though I was going through this robotic process, I was gaining information. The kids came to school in disheveled uniforms. They craved the taste of chalk, which I later learned came from a calcium deficiency. They constantly wanted to be picked up. They were eager to have our approval, for their actions, for their work. They wanted our companionship, our love, much more than anything I could have given them from my Western education. The last day I held my student Vishnu in my arms, fighting back the tears. Her tattered red uniform clung to my sari-covered body. She didn't understand what the moment meant to me. I had failed as a volunteer. I had failed as a teacher, but I had succeeded as a human. I had found love between students a month earlier I hadn't been able to relate to in the slightest. However, most of my students still struggled with alphabet and had trouble putting meaning behind what a number actually was. How will my time there affect them in the long run? I have no idea. Will I be just another white foreign face that gave them love for a month only to take it away? Perhaps. I had begun to realize that volunteering might not always be the answer to helping or to developing, but it would take me a few more months to truly understand where I belonged as an agent of social change. Suddenly, everything slowed down significantly. South Africa and India have been a whirlwind of cultural engagement, long work days and deep seminars. I had spent the last few months seeing what was wrong with the world, seeing injustice, but I had little time to take a closer look at who I was becoming. Seeing so much poverty left me feeling exhausted and guilty. How was I tired from a poverty that was not my own? That was not my constant reality. How was I tired from a poverty that was my reasoning to travel the world, a poverty I had seen through my opportunity? I felt undefined. This feeling left me unorganized and frustrated. I had seen so much, but I was still unsure of what my beliefs were, and what was I truly passionate about. I wonder how I was supposed to be an agent of change if I didn't even know myself. In Thailand, we did not have the usual divide between work, learning, and our homestays. Instead, they were all interconnected. I stayed in Wai Tong during their off-season of farming, so instead of having a hands-on experience with the agriculture industry, I was asked to instead learn from a more intensive homestay experience. The whirlwind created by the last 2 countries left me feeling exhausted. I always had something I could be doing. In Wai Tong things were my Penrai, don't worry. In a culture that did not worry about being on time or how every moment could be most efficient, I was able to finally receive needed downtime to process the previous 3 months' events and begin my own journey of self-discovery. During seminars, our group began discussing not only our current agricultural system, but also our relationship with food. Over the past few months, what I had consumed had been out of my control. I ate what my host parents gave me. Food was not something I had to think about, and I realized I liked it that way. I soon began to question if my own relationship to food was as healthy as I had thought, and found my interest turning to America's body image problem. I had never had an eating disorder. On paper, my relationship to food was just fine. But in reality, throughout high school, I had experienced extreme guilt when eating unhealthily. At times, I would go on strict diets and workout binges. I felt uncomfortable in a bikini despite being a size 6 at the time. I didn't feel as pretty as my peers. My body was neither stick thin or curvy. I represented neither of the bodies typically idolized as American beauty. Why had body image impacted the way I ate throughout high school? Why did I feel like I must be stick thin in order to be considered beautiful? In my Thai community, my host parents' goal was to have us gain weight during our stay. With the help of a translator, I interviewed some of the women who lived in our village, including my own host mother. I asked them what was the most beautiful part of them. The majority of the women said their heart. I had always seen Asian women as a marginalized group, oppressed by their political structure and conservative culture. But I was beginning to wonder if female oppression seeped into my own culture, into my own life, and I soon came to the conclusion that yes, I, as a woman, am still treated inequitably even in American society. Here started my journey to feminism, which would come to define my interests and fuel my passions throughout the rest of the trip. I also began to take a closer look into my eating. I'm from the South. We like our bacon, we like our steak, and we love our barbecue. I had never had an ethical problem with eating meat. I always just thought it was part of the food chain. What I hadn't thought about was the environmental impact of being a meat eater. Once leaving my homestay in Thailand, I became a vegetarian. Through this, I became an agent of change. Defining myself as a member of these communities and movements empowered me. It took tears, questioning, and honesty with myself to begin to understand my life at home, my time abroad, and the possibilities for my future. I suddenly saw what I could do daily to make an instant difference, taking an active approach to creating the change I wished to see in the world. But most importantly, I began to define myself. I began a relationship with myself. What I wanted to see was how I could translate this feeling of empowerment into my work as a volunteer. I shrieked, my voice flooding through the rainforest. My host mom, Marcia, quickly swiped at my body as hundreds of little ants swarmed up my pant legs, frantically biting at any bare skin they made contact with. After we had managed to knock off and squash each pesky menace, Marcia and I exchanged light-hearted commentary about the comical situation. As I tried to find the right words in Spanish, but there wasn't time for lengthy conversation. Today was just another day that hundreds of plants needed to be planted as part of our mass reforestation project in Ecuador. Each day, we tackled a new desolate field, owned by one of our host families, and side by side with them, we dug hundreds of holes, carefully unwrapping each plant and setting them individually into the ground. At the end of each workday, I was crusted and caked with dirt, splattered with earth, wearing all of my hard work. At the end of each day, there was tangible evidence of what I was doing, a measurable change in the landscape. The first day we arrived in the community of Bua, we were taught how to properly use our tools and how to effectively plant a sapling. I was confident in my ability to be successful. I began feeling like the agent of change I had seen myself becoming throughout Thailand. Most importantly, I understood my position in the environmental crisis we were trying to fix. The trees I was planting would positively affect the local ecosystem, but would also leave the entire planet healthier. I began to understand my connection as a volunteer. I was also relieved to not be in charge. Don Alfonso, a member of the community, led the greater project. He wanted to educate me on the importance of protecting the natural environment, and he gave me the opportunity to help in the reforestation process. But the bulk of the project was led by the community, the property owners, by locals, instead of the white faces I had become used to seeing in charge during my time abroad. Throughout the trip, our group had talked a lot about mutual liberation. Most of us struggled with what it meant to be white American volunteers abroad. But trying to help someone else couldn't be so negative, could it? I thought there must be some way to be a volunteer without repercussions. Mutual liberation was the answer to the questions I had been asking. The words service or volunteerism imply that a positive influence is only going one way. It is going to the person in need, the person that is helpless. But just like in every other human interaction, benefits flow each way. This is what mutual liberation signifies. Not one person is being liberated, but both. Both people are benefiting in a joint effort to improve the surrounding world. I began to understand this concept of mutual liberation as I worked alongside people from a completely different culture than mine, that spoke a different language than me, but that shared the same goal. I began to understand it, but I don't think I fully fleshed out what mutual liberation meant to me until returning back to the United States. I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world. A beautiful little fool, says Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby. Well, I have come back, and I am no longer a beautiful little fool. I better understand other cultures, my own culture, and who I want to be in the context of our current societal structures. I better understand foreign aid, my white privilege, and who I want to be as a volunteer. Throughout our time in DC, we have talked excessively about humanitarian work with various development-oriented agencies. We have seen the good intentions that we have been talking about throughout the last 6 months. What I have noticed within many of the corporations we have talked to is a lack of basic connections. There is a disconnect between the people in Washington and the people they are helping. There is a disconnect between their understanding of their presence abroad and its actual effects. There is an assumption that they know the right way, and that they know the best way to implement change. But how can we help a community we have never seen? How can we truly understand their needs? And is it our responsibility to be the foreign white face that implements another country's development? I've seen what it means to be untrained, to not devote appropriate time, to be a foreign face. I've seen the effects that this has had on the communities I was simply trying to help. But more importantly than having seen aid done wrong, I've seen aid done right. I've seen how powerful a caregiver can be in empowering her community. I've seen her ability to relate to her neighbors, to communicate in her language, to understand her community's issues, to know the back roads and the local hangouts, and be surrounded by the stigma of an infectious disease that plagues her neighborhood. I've seen the ability to preserve culture in Thailand as a community organized rules and regulations for their own community-based tourism. I've seen an Ecuadorian community thrive as they introduced agriculture to their society with physical help from volunteers, but the hard work, the mental work done by their community. Many of the organizations we talked to were still there to save them, still there to impose their Western ideals. They were still just a white face. Many of the people we talked to had never been to the countries they were trying to help, to develop. They seemed so disconnected. I wonder if maybe this is why we continuously fail at development and foreign aid as Americans, because of our inability to see people as people and understand our connections to them. This disconnection is what allows us to see ourselves as the volunteer savior. It is what allows us to ignore our role in oppression. Because of this trip, I can no longer ignore that role. I can't help but see my paper as the trees I once planted in Ecuador, as seeing the clothes in store windows as the underpaid labor of my Indian students' parents, as seeing what I put into my mouth each meal as a social statement. I can't help but wonder about the connections and become frustrated at a lack of transparency in the process. Now I understand my effect on each person. My conscience is not clean until I can make day-to-day decisions without feeling the negative impact on people abroad. My liberation is tied in theirs. My happiness is tied in theirs. I understand that I'm not free until everyone is free. I understand that I can't take advantage of people just because they don't belong to my nation, don't practice my religion, or have a different skin color. I understand that there is still slavery. This freedom I have to consume, to volunteer, to decide, has become a responsibility, as I understand its powerful hand in the injustice of the humanity of people across the globe. I understand my connectedness to our global community, but the black and white of morality has become blurred as I reclaim my spot in this society. thanks for listening to my really long speech. I would like to open the floor up for questions. Yes.
That was really fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. I liked the part where you started to talk about how things started to feel in context for you when, upon your return and doing some conversations with some of your site visits. Can you talk a little bit more about your conversations with some of the site visits and recognizing their disconnect from the communities they're trying to serve, and just kind of elaborate a little bit more on that experience?
So when we talk with the developmental agencies?
Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of them were the same as me. They were white, they were upper middle class, and a lot of them were women. That's typically the demographic of developmental workers. But basically, not all of them were the same, but I felt like the majority of them were still very disconnected from the situation that they were working with. They hadn't been to the communities that they were trying to help, which, without going there, without seeing it, it's really hard to understand what a community needs, and it's really hard to understand their culture and what may actually be offensive to them. So yeah, that was that. Yes.
You talked a lot about how you really didn't like, especially in India and South Africa, sort of the white, Western, paternalistic sort of view of, we're going to come and help you, we're saving you from all the terrible things you have, and how that was like, you talked about mutual liberation, how it was important for you to get something, or to learn from them and develop from them as much as they develop from you. Sort of in that vein, let's hypothetically, if you were the head of one of these development agencies and you had the opportunity to say, well, I know the way they're doing it is incorrect, what would you do on the ground in the vein of mutual liberation, as you explained, to make so it wasn't as paternalistic and sort of one-sided as it is?
Yeah, so my piece is called Clarity and Connections. So really it's about the connections. You want to be forming relationships with people. And that's something I didn't really understand up until maybe even Ecuador. I started realizing it more in Thailand. But in South Africa, I still felt like I was supposed to be there to save people. And then I realized that the most important thing that I had contributed was my relationships with people. My relationships with my caregiver and my relationships with my patients. So as a developmental agency, these people should be putting out their social workers and making them form relationships within the community. There's really no other way to do it.
Well, I have to be challenging here, I suppose.
Gosh.
But, I don't know, I sense more like there's more of a feeling of I have to go help people, not I have to go save people. And so I was curious, did you experience that more? Like, not like we're here to save you as an American, but more just like we happen to be well off and we're going to help you. I sense more an anxiety or hostility almost that you're white and middle class. So you are. But big deal. You're here to help them and give confidence and do something. And so I was wondering how you would respond to that.
Okay.
If you didn't see much.
Well, I know for me personally, I used to consider help and save like a synonym, though they're very different things. So in my letter to myself that we wrote at the beginning of the trip, I have this like sentence in it where I'm like, you're going to like save people. I mean, it wasn't exactly like that. I mean, it wasn't quite as arrogant, but like, I mean, it really was like, I thought I had the opportunity to save these people. Now helping is different, but I think it comes back to knowing that they are helping you in the same way that you are helping them. You might be helping them on a more like financial matter, but they're helping you grow, they're helping you learn, they're helping you understand the world. So it's remembering that it goes both ways.
In some ways, maybe Thailand, the village there, was the least developed by Western standards. But sounds like for you that maybe, was there a difference in perspective? I mean, in some ways, are they more connected as a community, or I don't know, it seems like there was something there.
Yeah. So our Thailand community was very rural. They lived in a national park, and it was like a 3-hour drive from any major, not even major, small city. But the community was very self-sustained, so they didn't really need outside help. But we would categorize them as undeveloped because their economic system isn't the same as ours. But really what they had there that I admired was a sense of community. They all helped each other. There was only 25 families there. So everybody knew each other, everybody was there for each other. And they really brought us in. They really wanted us to feel like part of their family. And they told us that you are now part of our family. So that's one of the biggest things I got away from Thailand.
Is there one spot you'd like to go back to?
Everywhere. No, I actually don't talk about Cambodia, which was a place that we only went to for a week as more of tourists than volunteers or any of the synonyms you want to associate with that. But there's a lot of problems with sex trafficking in Thailand, and my hope is to one day go back in Cambodia, and my hope is to one day go back and live in Cambodia and start an NGO there. So, yeah, so now it's stated on public record. So yeah.
What are you planning to do next year?
I'm going to Ithaca College and studying communications. I'm interested in working in public relations. No.
Yes, Charlotte. She's one of 10 people who won. She won the scholarship. She has a full ride to college out of 500 people that applied. She went and interviewed last week, and yeah.
Thanks, guys.